The 26th of February, 1893, a crew working for the Thomas Nestor estate, cutting a stand of white pine near Ewan, Michigan, in Ontonagon County, decided to try something nobody had done before. They stacked a haul sled higher than any haul sled had ever been stacked. When they were finished, the sled held 50 logs of white pine. 50. The total weight was 144 tons. That is 288,000 pounds of timber sitting on a single wooden sled. That sled then moved 6 miles across frozen ground to the Ontonagon River, pulled by a single team of horses, on a road made entirely of ice that men had been pouring water on every night for weeks. It is the largest single horse-drawn load of logs ever recorded in American history. There is a photograph. The men stand around the sled like they are standing next to a small building made of timber. The load measured 18 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 33 feet from the top of the stack to the roadbed. When the load reached the river, it was disassembled, loaded onto 9 railroad flat cars, and shipped to Chicago. It was displayed at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition as one of the wonders of the world. There is even a commemorative medal. On one side, a logging camp. On the other, the load itself, with the inscription, Champion Load of Logs, 36,055 feet, weight, 144 tons, drawn by estate of Thomas Nestor. The teamster who drove those horses earned about $35 a month and board. The horses got an extra ration of oats. The pine on that sled contained 36,055 board feet of lumber, enough to frame several houses. And those houses were probably built in Chicago, and some of them are probably still standing today. I have been reading the records of the Great Lakes lumber camps from that era. The thing they did with ice and horses and frozen water in the 1880s and 1890s should not have been possible, but it was. And the system they built to do it is one of the most ingenious pieces of forgotten engineering in American history. This is how America moved logs that weighed more than a locomotive through the frozen wilderness, using nothing but ice, horses, and men who were willing to die for $1.75 a day. If you've watched this channel before, you know I don't say things like that lightly. To understand why any of this was necessary, you need to understand what northern Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota looked like in the 1880s. You need to understand the ground itself, because the ground is where the entire problem started. The northern forests of the Great Lakes states sat on some of the most difficult terrain in America. Not mountains, not desert, swamp. In the summer months, the ground across vast stretches of northern Wisconsin was a sodden, spongy mess of peat and standing water and decaying vegetation. If you walked through it, you sank to your shins. If you stood still, you sank deeper. The mosquitoes came in clouds so thick that horses would panic and bolt. The rivers were sluggish, meandering things, choked with deadfall and beaver dams. The trails, where trails existed at all, were mud troughs that would swallow a wagon to its axles. Men who tried to move timber in summer described the experience as trying to drag freight through pudding. A single white pine log, fresh cut, could weigh anywhere from 2 to 5 tons depending on its length and diameter. Some of the old-growth pines in those forests stood 150 feet tall and measured 4 feet across at the base. Try to imagine dragging one of those logs across a swamp in July. You cannot. Nobody could. The friction alone would stop a team of horses in its tracks. The wheels would sink. The mud would grip. Nothing was moving through that ground when it was wet. But then winter came. And when winter came to northern Wisconsin in the 1880s, it came hard. Temperatures would drop to 20, 30, sometimes 40 below zero. The swamps froze solid. The rivers locked up. The peat turned to stone. The air was so cold that if you spat, the saliva would freeze before it hit the ground. The trees cracked in the night with sounds like rifle shots as the sap inside them froze and expanded. Your breath would crystallize on your beard and form a mask of ice around your mouth and nose. And suddenly, that impossible ground became the best freight highway in America, because ice has almost no friction. A load that would take 20 horses to drag across dry ground in summer could be pulled by 4 horses on ice in winter, sometimes 2. Sometimes, on a perfect road with a light grade, a single team could haul a load that would boggle the mind. That is not an exaggeration. That is physics. The coefficient of friction between a steel-shod wooden runner and a polished ice surface is nearly zero. The logging companies understood this. Maybe not in those terms, but they understood it in their bones. And so the entire economy of the northern timber industry was built around a single, desperate fact. You had roughly 4 months, from late November to early March, to cut every tree you needed, drag every log to the river, and stack it on the bank to wait for the spring thaw. If the thaw came early, you were done. If you hadn't moved your timber, it sat in the woods and rotted. 4 months. That was all you got. And in those 4 months, the men and horses of the Great Lakes lumber camps moved more timber than most modern operations move in a year. According to the 1,890 census, more than 23,000 men worked in Wisconsin's logging industry alone. Another 32,000 worked at the sawmills. Each winter, the lumberjacks occupied nearly 450 logging camps. In the spring, they drove their timber downstream to more than 1,000 mills. Logging and lumbering employed a quarter of all working Wisconsinites in the 1890s. A quarter. And the peak came in the winter of 1892 to 1893, when loggers on the upper Mississippi River and its tributaries north of Little Falls cut 674 million board feet of timber. The following winter, they cut another 500 million. That is 1.17 billion board feet in 2 seasons. Enough pine was harvested from the Black River Valley alone to build a boardwalk 9 feet wide and 4 inches thick around the entire world. But none of that timber was going anywhere without roads. And in the northern woods in winter, there was only one kind of road that worked: ice roads. Now, when I say ice road, I don't mean a frozen river. I don't mean a trail that happened to have some ice on it. I mean a road that was engineered from scratch, built through the forest, cleared of every stump and stone, graded for drainage, packed with snow, and then glazed with water every single night until the surface was as hard and smooth as a marble floor. These roads were the arteries of the entire operation. Without them, nothing moved. And building them was one of the most labor-intensive jobs in the camp. It started with the swampers. Swampers were the road crew. They went into the woods with axes and grub hoes and cut a path wide enough for a sled and a team of horses. They cleared brush, pulled stumps, filled holes, and leveled the grade as best they could. A good ice road needed to be relatively flat, because you could control a sled going downhill on ice about as well as you could control a boulder. The swampers worked ahead of the cutting crews, sometimes by weeks, sometimes by months. They were among the lowest paid men in the camp, earning $10 to $18 a month and board, but without them, no tree that got cut was going anywhere. The lumberjacks worked 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, regardless of weather. They wore wool, every layer of it: wool socks, wool long underwear, wool pants, wool shirts, wool coats, wool hats. They avoided cotton as if it were poison, because cotton, when it got wet from sweat or snow, lost its insulating properties and could kill a man through hypothermia faster than bare skin. Wet wool kept you alive. Wet cotton killed you. The men knew this the way they knew their own names. Most of them never knew the actual air temperature on any given day. They did not own thermometers. They judged the cold by how quickly their nostrils froze shut when they breathed through their nose, by the sound the snow made under their boots, by how fast the sap froze on a fresh-cut stump. They preferred the deep cold of January to the warming days of March, because wet wool did not dry well overnight in the bunkhouse, and a January thaw meant days of working in damp clothes that never fully dried. Once the timber was cut, it had to be gathered. The felled logs were dragged by horses to large piles called skidways or rollways, stacked alongside the ice road in pyramids that could hold hundreds of logs. From the skidways, the loading crew would select logs for each sled load. The decking crew stacked the logs at the skidway. The skidding crew dragged them from the cutting site. The loading crew put them on the sled. The teamster hauled them to the river landing. And at the river landing, another crew scaled the logs, measuring the board feet with a scrivener's rule, marking each log with the company's bark stamp and end stamp, and rolling them down the bank to wait for the spring thaw. It was a chain, and every link in that chain was a group of men and horses working in the cold. But none of it worked without the road, and the road required the sprinkler crew. This is where the engineering gets genuinely remarkable. The sprinkler sled was a large wooden tank, essentially a box on runners that held roughly 500 gallons of water. It was pulled by a team of 2 horses, and it had valves on the back that could be opened to release water in a controlled flow across the road surface. The water would pour out in a thin sheet, spread across the packed snow, and freeze overnight into a layer of ice. Night after night, the sprinkler crew would make their runs, adding layer after layer. Each pass added maybe a quarter inch of ice. After weeks of this, the road surface would be inches thick, smooth, and incredibly hard. Sprinkling began around 1872 and required an extra 2 horses and 2 workers to operate. 1 cartload of water could ice about 4 to 6 miles of road. But here is the detail that separates an ice road from a frozen trail. After the ice was laid down, a device called a rudder was dragged over the surface. The rudder was essentially a heavy sled with steel blades mounted on the bottom, set at the exact width of the haul sled's runners. It carved 2 parallel grooves into the ice, about 5 feet apart. Those grooves were the tracks. Once the grooves were cut and re-iced, the haul sled's runners would sit down into them like a train sits on rails. The sled could not veer left or right. It could not wander off the road. It was locked into those grooves, and it would follow them for miles with almost no steering effort from the teamster. The horses only had to pull. The road did the rest. You need to think about that for a moment. These men, working in darkness at 20 below zero, built a guidance system out of frozen water. No metal rails, no concrete, no machinery, just water, cold air, and a steel-bladed sled. And it worked so well that a team of horses could pull 144 tons of timber 6 miles without the load deviating more than a few inches from its path. But the ice roads had a problem, and the problem was hills. Even a slight downgrade on an ice road could turn a loaded sled into a runaway. 144 tons of timber on a frictionless surface, going downhill, with living animals attached to the front. Think about that. If the sled started to gain on the horses could be crushed. The tongue of the sled could snap. The whole load could jackknife and scatter logs across the road like matchsticks. And a single white pine log rolling free weighs as much as a car. The solution was sand. On every downhill grade, a man called the sand monkey, or sometimes the hay monkey, was stationed with a barrel of sand and a shovel. His job was to throw sand onto the ice in the rudder grooves just before the sled reached the hill. The sand increased the friction just enough to slow the sled so the horses could stay ahead of the load. Too little sand, and the sled overran the team. Too much, and the horses couldn't pull the load up the next rise. The sand monkey had to judge the weight of the load, the grade of the hill, the temperature of the air, and the condition of the ice, and get the amount of sand exactly right, every single time. For every single sled, all day long, in the dark, in the cold, standing next to a road where 100-ton loads were sliding past him at walking speed, close enough to touch. If he got it wrong, men died, horses died. Now let me tell you about the sleds themselves, because the engineering of a haul sled is something that deserves to be remembered. A haul sled was not a toboggan. It was a heavy-duty freight vehicle built to carry loads that would crush a modern pickup truck. The base was a pair of massive wooden runners, usually made from hardwood, shod with steel on the bottom to reduce friction and protect the wood. The runners were typically 12 to 16 feet long and curved up at the front so they wouldn't dig into the ice. Connecting the runners was a set of crossbeams called bunks. The bunks were the platform on which the logs rested. They were spaced apart, typically 2 bunks per sled, and each bunk had vertical posts on the sides called stakes, or stake pockets. The stakes kept the logs from rolling off the sides of the sled during transport. Loading a haul sled was an art, and a dangerous one. The bottom logs had to be the largest and heaviest, because they formed the foundation. If you put small logs on the bottom and large logs on top, the weight distribution would be unstable, and the whole load could shift and collapse during the haul. The logs were rolled up onto the sled using a system of chains, cant hooks, and sometimes a device called a jammer, which was essentially a small wooden crane powered by a horse walking in a circle at the end of a sweep arm. The jammer horse walked round and round, tightening a cable that lifted the log from the skidway and swung it onto the sled. Each log was positioned carefully by the loading crew, men standing on the stack with peavies and cant hooks, guiding logs that weighed a ton or more into position. Each log was chained in place, and then the next layer was added. The chains had to be tight. A loose chain meant a log could shift during the haul, and a shifting log at height could bring down the entire stack. As the load grew higher, the work became more dangerous. Men were standing on top of logs 20 and 30 feet in the air, on a surface made of frozen bark that was slick with frost. They were working with chains and hooks, rolling timber that weighed thousands of pounds. There were no safety ropes, no helmets, no harnesses. A single slip, a single chain that didn't hold, and a man could be crushed between two logs or thrown from the stack to the frozen ground below. The loading crew worked in the half-light of early morning, their breath steaming, their hands numb in wet leather gloves, their footing uncertain on every step. The record loads, the ones that made the photographs, were stacked so high that they defied belief. The Nestor estate load at Ewan stood 33 feet from the road surface to the top of the stack. That is the height of a 3-story building, sitting on a sled, on ice, being pulled by horses. The June 1893 issue of Scribner's magazine described a similar load as 18 feet long, 15 feet wide, and over 33 feet high, weighing more than 100 tons, hauled by a single team over specially prepared ice-covered roads. The writer called it one of the wonders of the world. He was not exaggerating. But the loads you see in the photographs were not the typical daily loads. Most haul sleds carried 15 to 30 logs, totaling perhaps 20 to 50 tons. The record loads were built specifically for the photographs and for the expositions. They were advertising. The lumber companies knew that a photograph of an impossibly tall stack of logs pulled by a team of horses through the snow was worth more than any newspaper advertisement. Those photographs were printed as postcards, distributed at trade shows, and sent to potential investors back east. They said, "Look at what we can do. Look at the timber we have. Look at the scale of this operation. Come invest your money in Wisconsin pine." Some of the loads were staged. The sled would be loaded to its maximum height at a convenient location near a photographer, the team would be hitched, the sled would be pulled a short distance for the camera, and then the load would be broken down and hauled in smaller, safer loads to the river. But many of them were real. The Nestor estate load was pulled 6 miles to the Ontonagon River, 6 miles on ice, with 144 tons behind the horses. That was not a stunt. That was a haul. And now we need to talk about the horses, because no story about ice road logging is complete without talking about the animals that made it possible. The horses that worked in the Great Lakes lumber camps were almost exclusively draft breeds, Percherons and Belgians primarily, with some Clydesdales mixed in. These were the largest, strongest horses in the world. A mature Belgian draft horse stood 16 to 18 hands, high, and weighed between 1,800 and 2,400 pounds. The Percheron was slightly leaner, typically 1,900 to 2,000 pounds, but with a reputation for endurance and agility that made them the preferred logging horse in many camps. By the early 1900s, the Percheron was America's most numerous draft breed, with 40,000 broodmares registered by 1915. By the 1890s, more than 10,000 horses were needed to supply the logging operations of Minnesota alone. These animals were not pets, they were not companions. They were the most valuable equipment in the camp, worth more than most of the men who drove them. A good team of draft horses could cost a lumber company $300 to $500 in the 1890s, the equivalent of roughly $10,000 to $15,000 today. The teamster who drove them might earn $35 a month. Do the math. The horses were worth a year of the man's wages, and the camp treated them accordingly. The horses were housed in barns built from logs and tar paper, kept warmer and drier than the men in the bunkhouses. The men slept in rows of bunks in a single long building, packed together for warmth, their clothes hanging from the ceiling beams to dry overnight, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke, and the unwashed bodies of 100 men. The horses, by contrast, had individual stalls. They had clean bedding. They had ventilation. A sick horse was attended to immediately. A sick man waited until Sunday, if he was lucky. The horses were fed enormous quantities of oats, hay, and fresh water. A working draft horse consumed 40 to 50 pounds of hay per day, plus 10 to 15 pounds of grain. A camp with 50 horses needed tons of feed hauled in before the season started, usually by wagon in the autumn before the snow came. The feed was stored in a separate building, kept dry and away from vermin. The blacksmith in camp spent much of his time shoeing horses, fitting them with special caulked shoes that gripped the ice. The caulks were sharp steel points, like cleats, driven into the horseshoe to give the animal traction on the frozen road. A horse with bad shoes on an ice road was a dead horse, and probably a dead teamster with it. A horse that slipped and went down under a loaded sled did not get up. The bond between a teamster and his horses was absolute. A good teamster knew his animals by name, by temperament, by the way they pulled, by the sounds they made when they were tired or afraid. He knew when to push them and when to rest them. He knew the difference between a horse that was being stubborn and a horse that was telling him the load was too heavy or the road was too dangerous. The best teamsters in camp were the highest paid men after the foreman. They earned up to $35 a month and board, while ordinary laborers made $10 to $18. And they earned every cent because the job could kill them on any given morning. If you want to subscribe to this channel, now would be a good time. I cover the forgotten labor that built this country, and there is always more to tell. The teamster's day started before dawn. He would go to the barn, feed and water his team, harness them, inspect their shoes, check the harness for weak points, and then walk them to the loading area. The loading crew would have the sled packed and chained by the time the teamster arrived. He would inspect the load himself, checking the chains, the stakes, the balance. If he did not trust the load, he could refuse to haul it. A good foreman respected that. A bad foreman did not, and men died because of it. Once the load was secured, the teamster would climb onto the front of the sled, take up the reins, and give the signal. The horses would lean into the harness. There was always a moment, a single held breath, when the full weight of the load pressed against the harness and the runners sat frozen to the ice. Then the sled would break free with a crack, and the team would begin to walk. On a good ice road, on flat ground, the friction was so low that even a massive load moved smoothly. The horses walked at about 2 miles per hour. The runners hissed on the ice. The chains creaked. The logs groaned as they settled against each other. But the moment the road tilted downhill, everything changed. The teamster's entire focus shifted to the grade ahead. He would call to his horses, urging them to pick up their pace so the sled didn't push them from behind. If the grade was steep, the sand monkey should have already laid down his sand. The teamster would watch the tongue of the sled, the long beam connecting the sled to the horses. If the tongue started to compress, if it started to push against the horses instead of being pulled by them, the load was gaining speed. And once a loaded sled started to run on ice, there was no stopping it. Runaway sleds were the most feared event in the camps. A sled loaded with 30 or 50 tons of timber, sliding downhill on ice, could reach speeds that the horses simply could not outrun. The tongue would buckle, then snap with a sound like a cannon shot. The horses, suddenly free of the sled but tangled in their harness, would be thrown sideways or swept under the runners. The sled would leave the grooves and scatter logs across the road and into the trees. A white pine log, rolling free, weighs as much as an automobile. It does not stop when it hits something soft. Men standing nearby, men who were walking ahead to the next loading point, men who were spreading sand on the next hill, could be hit by rolling logs and killed instantly. The sound of a runaway was unmistakable to anyone who had heard it once. The crack of the tongue, the scream of the horses, that was the sound that haunted the men. The scream of a draft horse in panic is a sound that goes through you. Then the low thunder of logs breaking free from the chains, tumbling and rolling and smashing through anything in their path. Survivors described it as the worst sound they ever heard. Some men who lived through a runaway never drove again. They took lower-paying jobs in camp, sawing or swamping, rather than sit behind a team on an iced road with a loaded sled behind them. There are no comprehensive casualty records from the Great Lakes lumber camps. Nobody was counting. These men were seasonal workers, many of them immigrants from Norway, Ireland, French Canada, Sweden, and Finland, whose names were recorded in camp ledgers that were often burned or discarded when the camp moved on. Some were Ojibwe. Some were the sons of farmers who needed winter wages to keep a homestead alive. Many had left their families behind and traveled from state to state following the timber, from Maine to Michigan to Wisconsin to Minnesota, as the forests were cut and the work moved west. They lived in bunkhouses that were long, low buildings made of logs, roofed with tar paper, heated by a single iron stove in the center. The men slept in double-decker bunks along the walls, packed so close together that a man could not turn over without disturbing the men on either side. Lice were a certainty. The smell was something you never forgot. a mixture of pine pitch, wood smoke, sweat, drying wool, and the bodies of 100 men who had not bathed since November. When a man died in camp, he was buried nearby if the ground was not frozen too hard to dig. If it was, and it usually was, the body was kept in an outbuilding until spring. His family, if he had one, might not learn of his death for months. There was no telegraph in the woods. There was no mail service in winter. A letter sent from a lumber camp in January might not reach a wife in Norway until May. The injuries that did not kill were often permanent. Crushed limbs from rolling logs, broken backs from falls off the skidway, severed fingers from axes and crosscut saws, frostbite that took fingers and toes, sometimes feet, sometimes hands. The camp had no doctor. The cook might have a bottle of whiskey and a rudimentary understanding of splints, but that was the extent of the medical care. The nearest town might be 40 miles away by sled. A man with a broken leg in a lumber camp in January in northern Wisconsin had a simple choice: endure the journey out, bouncing on a sled over frozen ruts for a full day or more, or wait until spring. Many chose to wait. Some did not survive the wait. I want you to hold that in your mind as I tell you what happened to this system, because what replaced it was both a mercy and a loss. The lumber railroads began to arrive in the 1890s. At first, they were narrow-gauge lines, pushed into the woods on temporary track laid over rough-cut ties to connect the camps to the main rail lines. They were crude things, these logging railroads. The rails were light, the roadbed was barely graded. The locomotives were small, second-hand engines that had been retired from mainline service. But they could haul logs year-round, not just in winter. They could reach timber that was miles from any river, timber that could never have been floated downstream. And they could carry loads that dwarfed even the biggest ice road sleds. A single railroad flat car could carry what 3 or 4 sled loads had carried. A train of 20 cars could empty a season's worth of skidway timber in a single trip. The advantages were overwhelming. A railroad did not melt. A railroad did not require a sprinkler crew working every night in January. A railroad did not depend on the temperature staying below zero. And a railroad did not need horses. The economics were clear, and one by one, the lumber companies built their spur lines into the woods and retired their ice road operations. If you've been watching this channel, you might want to hit subscribe because this story is not finished. Not even close. The railroads transformed the logging industry in ways that went far beyond transportation. With railroads, the camps could operate 12 months a year instead of 4. The seasonal rhythm of the ice road, that desperate race against the spring thaw, was broken. Men could work through summer. The camps grew larger. Bunkhouses, kitchens, dining halls, company stores, blacksmith shops, carpentry shops. The camps became small towns, and the rate of cutting accelerated enormously. By 1900, the ice roads were already dying. By 1910, they were rare. By 1920, they were gone from most of the Great Lakes states. The last of the old-growth white pine in Wisconsin was cut in the early 1900s. The forest that had seemed endless, that had produced enough timber to build a boardwalk around the world, were stumps. Frederick Weyerhaeuser and his syndicate, the conglomerate that had dominated the Chippewa River watershed, moved their operations west to the Pacific Northwest, where the Douglas fir and the Sitka spruce were waiting. The same pattern would repeat itself. Cut everything, move on. The logging trucks came in the 1930s, and they finished what the railroads had started. A truck could go anywhere a road could reach. It didn't need ice, it didn't need grooves, it didn't need sand monkeys, or sprinkler sleds, or rudder crews, and it didn't need horses. The draft horses disappeared from the woods almost as fast as the white pine had. By the 1950s, the Percheron, which had been America's dominant draft breed, with over 33,000 registered animals in 1930, had collapsed to 85 registered horses in 1954. 85. From tens of thousands to 85 in a single generation, the Belgians fared somewhat better, but not by much. The animals that had built the lumber industry, that had hauled 144 tons of timber across ice, that had fed the sawmills that built Chicago and Milwaukee and Minneapolis, were simply no longer needed. Nobody was breeding them, nobody was training them, nobody was feeding them. They were sold for meat or turned out to die. A few breeders kept the lines alive through the 1950s and 1960s, and by the 1980s, interest in draft horses began to recover. Today, roughly 2,500 Percherons are registered annually in the United States. But the working logging horse, the animal that knew the feel of ice under its shoes and the weight of a loaded tongue against its chest, is gone. I want to end with a photograph. The one taken near Ewen, Michigan, on the 26th of February, 1893. Look at it carefully if you ever get the chance. You can find it in the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Michigan Technological University Archives, and in the collection at the Forest History Society. There is also the commemorative medal from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In the photograph, you see the sled. You see the logs stacked to an absurd height, 33 feet, higher than many of the trees still standing around the clearing. You see the team of horses, hitched to the front, standing calmly in the snow. And you see the men. Some of them are standing on the ground beside the sled. Some of them are perched on top of the stack, 3 stories in the air, posing. They are wearing wool, every one of them. Wool coats, wool pants, wool hats. Their boots are leather, probably frozen stiff. Their faces, in the photographs where you can see them, are weathered and lean. These are not large men. Most lumberjacks were surprisingly small by modern standards, but they are standing next to something they built with chains, cant hooks, horses, and ice. 144 tons, 6 miles, one team, on a road made of frozen water. There is no machine operating today that can do what those horses did per pound of body weight. A modern logging truck carries perhaps 25 tons, and it weighs 12 tons itself. Those horses weighed a combined total of maybe 16,000 pounds and pulled 288,000 pounds. That is a ratio of 18-to-1. No internal combustion engine in any logging truck on Earth comes close to that ratio. The horses did it because the road was perfect. The road was perfect because men built it by hand, in the dark, at 20 below, pouring water onto snow and letting physics do the rest. I think about the sprinkler crew sometimes. 2 men and 2 horses driving a 500-gallon tank of water down a forest road at midnight in January. The temperature is 30 below. The water is sloshing in the tank and starting to skin over with ice before it even hits the ground. The valve has to be adjusted constantly because the flow rate changes as the water cools. The horses are walking slowly, their breath freezing in clouds around their heads. The road stretches ahead in the darkness, lit by a lantern on the front of the tank. Behind them, the water spreads across the packed snow and begins to freeze almost immediately, adding another layer to the road that will carry 100 tons of timber in the morning. Nobody photographed the sprinkler crew. Nobody wrote their names in the camp ledger with any special distinction. They were paid the same as any other laborer, $10 to $18 a month, and board. But without them, the ice road did not exist. Without the ice road, the timber did not move. Without the timber, the sawmills stood silent, and the cities of the Midwest went unbuilt. That is the thing about the systems that built this country. The people who did the most essential work were almost always the least remembered. The swampers who cleared the road, the sprinkler crew who glazed it with ice, the sand monkeys who kept the sleds from running away, the teamsters who drove the horses themselves. All of them are gone now. The ice roads melted more than a century ago. The white pine forests they served are stumps and second growth. The camps are rotted foundations in the woods, if they are anything at all. But the lumber they moved built a civilization. The floors you may be standing on right now, if your house is old enough and you live in the right part of the Midwest, might have been cut from a white pine that was hauled on an ice road by a team of Percherons in 1893. The boards were sawn in Oshkosh or Eau Claire or Stillwater, shipped by rail to Chicago or Milwaukee, sold at a lumber yard for a few dollars per 100 board feet, and nailed into a frame that is still standing 130 years later. If you think about that long enough, you start to understand something about the nature of work. The men who cut the trees are dead. The men who built the roads are dead. The men who drove the horses are dead. The horses are dead. The forests are gone. The ice roads are a memory that lives only in photographs and camp records that most people have never read. But the houses are still standing. The wood is still holding weight. The grain of the pine, tight and straight from growing slowly in a cold climate, is still doing what it was meant to do. There is a debt in that wood. A debt to the sprinkler crew driving their tank at midnight. A debt to the sand monkey standing beside the road with his shovel. A debt to the teamster who trusted his horses to stay ahead of 100 tons of timber on a sheet of ice. A debt to the horses who did it because they were asked, and because the road was good, and because the harness held. Subscribe to this channel if you believe this work deserves to be remembered, because I do. And I am not done telling these stories. 144 tons. 8 miles of ice. A single team of horses. And a photograph that most Americans have never seen. That was the lumber industry of the Great Lakes. That was how America moved 50-ton logs through snow. Not with engines, not with machines. With ice and horses and men who knew that the road had to be perfect because everything depended on it. Everything.